Some students at a high school have been identified in a non-credible shooting threat at a school. So take a look at this and then we'll talk.
Unified police have now identified the person they believe is responsible for a social media post that directed an unsubstantiated threat to Kearns High School. Fox 13 News reporter Chris Arnold spoke with the Granite School District within just the past hour. He joins us live from outside the Granite Education Center. Chris, what are they saying?
Well, good evening, Kelly. This letter went out to Granite School District parents and families about an hour or so ago, detailing what the district and UPD have been investigating. Now, the district tells me that student who was identified is a student at Kearns High School and could be facing charges of both administrative discipline and criminal charges, which police just told me could include terroristic threat charges as well. Now, Matt Sampson, a spokesman with the Granite School District, says there were reports of a generic threat made about 2 weeks ago, but they could not pinpoint where that photo came from until it began circulating around social media last night. Now, he says at the same time, police were able to determine that it was related to Kearns High School specifically. Now, Sampson says that image was posted to a group chat on Snapchat by the suspect as a joke, showing a metal beam where the words "the shooting" and today's date, December 5th, 2022, had been written. Now, Sampson says through the police investigation, it became clear the threat wasn't credible and the suspect didn't have the means to carry it out. Now, in an earlier statement today, many parents were up in arms on social media when the district asked them to be more proactive when it comes to monitoring their children's social media. So I asked Sampson, why is it so important to have their help?
We've been dealing with threats like this consistently. They're taxing. They're enormously taxing, both in terms of the amount of resources that are used by the district, the amount of resources that are used by law enforcement to investigate. We're asking parents to help because we need students to be aware of the very serious implications that posting fake social media threats like this have for them.
And to put this all in perspective, Sampson says the students in that group chat, who also go to Kearns High School, shared the post instead of reporting it, meaning they could also face administrative and criminal penalties as well. Now, again, while this threat was deemed not credible, Sampson says it did have an impact on attendance at Kearns High School today. He says it was down 50% because of this entire incident. For now, live in South Salt Lake, Chris Arnold, Fox 13 News, Utah.
Wow, so let me say this. I'm glad I never made a school threat, because if I did, I'd be sitting in jail. But what about discipline? Parents are speaking up about the lack of discipline that's happened, so watch.
Well, parents of East Hamilton Middle School students met with administrators tonight to express their concerns about safety and disciplinary measures.
Administrators listened and made some promises. Riley Nagel was there and brings us details.
Parents from East Hamilton Middle School say several bullying incidents have hindered their child's ability to learn and feel safe at school. Now parents are demanding the school to make some changes.
Teachers that I have spoken to believe that East Hamilton is a hostile learning environment for students, and it's a hostile work environment for teachers and administration.
More than 100 parents have band together hoping for a resolution. Many are saying there's a lack of discipline at school, and that has caused a few bullies to get out of control.
This school year, she walks out of class at will, openly curses at teachers, screams in the classroom, and curses and bullies other students.
Parents pointed out several more examples. One incident in August reportedly left a teacher with a broken finger after she tried to break up a fight between two students. And just 2 weeks ago, a student was found with a knife at school. In both cases, the students were given out-of-school suspension, but some parents are arguing a 1-year expulsion is necessary.
And I'm not saying they don't deserve a good education, they do, but discipline is also a part of education.
The principal of East Hamilton, Kristen Childs, told parents they are listening and are working to create a better culture for students and teachers. Childs says they put together a list of areas to refine, including additional support staff to handle discipline and behavior plan adjustments for troublesome students.
Ways to help kids when they come back from some sort of a consequence to have better behaviors, to find alternative behaviors that allow them to be more productive at school so that we don't have the same things happening over and over and over again.
Childs says starting holiday break, they'll reset their discipline policy for students, and she expects that the latter part of the year will be more successful for students, parents, and faculty alike.
We're going to go back and make sure that we reteach the things we need to teach so that we are sure that students understand what we expect.
Reporting in Chattanooga, I'm Riley Nagel, Local 3 News.
And I'm glad they're resetting this. Let me tell you something. If nothing's being done to prevent this from happening again, all of a sudden we're bouncing off the wall. And no one's using common sense to say, we've messed up, we made mistakes, now we have to pay the price and say, now we need to pay the price. And if the schools fix their mistakes, then obviously this will never happen again. So things have got to be changed. Coming up next, he's called the toughest sheriff. He had a plan to blow up the sheriff. There were lots of tapes and evidence happening. You'll meet the attorney and you'll hear those videotapes. And I do mean there were a lot of videotapes. Stay with us. It's the kind of evidence that usually leaves a criminal case to an end. The defendant caught on camera building a bomb and planning to commit the crime. The alleged target? A man who called himself the toughest sheriff. Sorry about that. But in tonight's story, there are lots of tapes, and you'll hear those tapes as the victim, the person who did this, is now the victim. So here's Josh Mankiewicz.
With guns drawn, a man who investigators say wanted to kill Sheriff Joe Arpaio is arrested.
It was a shocking assassination attempt, captured on videotape. A teenage felon released from prison exactly 1 day earlier, arrested in a murder-for-hire plot, accused of conspiring to knock off one of the most high-profile lawmen in the country.
Nobody is going to drive me out of this office.
The intended victim, Joe Arpaio, self-proclaimed toughest sheriff in America. He's famous in Phoenix, Arizona and beyond for dressing inmates in old-fashioned jailhouse stripes, working them in chain gangs, feeding them on the cheap with bologna sandwiches, and making them live in tents under the broiling desert sun. The plot: build a pipe bomb packed with ball bearings and blast the sheriff to kingdom come. The perp, James Seville, an 18-year-old who had just finished a stretch in prison for trying to blow up a high school, now caught on tape building the bomb and laughing about blowing away Sheriff Joe.
Looks like that sheriff. Yes, it does.
Seville had no idea that he'd been under surveillance the whole time, or that his accomplice was really an undercover detective, or that the detective, whom Seville knew only as Yancey, secretly recorded their conversations that day.
I mean, I'm a real pyro, but I do like blowing things up. It's about time I get paid for it.
Seville had been arrested at the tender age of 17 for breaking into his former high school and trying to blow it up. Now he talked about much bigger plans than just murdering the sheriff.
I was planning on doing some major damage to the city. Because I figured, I could cause an LA riot in Phoenix there by taking out the power lines and the water. There's no electrical power. I shoot somebody in the head. How the police gonna know?
The two men drove all over town so Seville could buy bomb parts, a pipe, batteries, wire, BBs to serve as shrapnel, model rocket motors he planned to grind up for the explosive charge. Seville sounded like a pro.
I like to go to all the stores and nothing's traceable.
Yancey asked repeatedly if Seville wanted to back out.
Okay, you sure you want to do this, right? Yeah. Okay, you don't want to back out or anything? Now's the time to do it.
So the two men came here, the Los Olivos Motel in downtown Phoenix. Detectives had wired a room with hidden cameras, and Seville was caught on tape building the bomb. Seville assembled everything except the explosive charge itself. Yancey paid him half the agreed-upon fee of $4,000 cash.
20, 30, 60, 85, $2,000.
Then the two men drove to a nearby restaurant where the sheriff's car was parked. Yancey asked Seville if he could kill the sheriff with a car bomb. Seville said sure.
That's supposed to put something under his car. Okay. The radio detonator is a switch. Okay. Gone. And what are you going to do it with me? The other one doesn't work? Well, I guess we'll have to.
But instead, it was Seville who got taken down. Sheriff's deputies rushed the car and grabbed him. Even hours later, as Seville was being interrogated, he couldn't seem to believe it.
Next thing I know, there's 100 police officers and helicopters and everything. I'm up against the car and in another car, and I don't know what the hell happened. And
So that must tell you something, right?
yeah,
What's that tell you?
I'm in deep.
A succinct assessment. Because if anybody ever seemed to be convicted on tape, it was James Seville. Even his lawyer, Ulysses Farragut, couldn't deny the obvious.
A lot of criminal attorneys don't want to know whether their client did it, and they don't ask. Did you ask?
Didn't need to. He did it. Jimmy Seville built a bomb. He was caught on tape building a bomb.
But soon Farragut heard from his client an unbelievable story. That the mad bomber captured on audio and videotape was a fiction, an elaborate act, and that Seville went through with the bombing plot not because he wanted to, but because he felt he had to.
And I'm looking at him with skepticism saying, what are you talking about here? Let's get real. But as things began to unfold, we started being able to confirm the very things that Jimmy Seville was saying.
Blank, bedraggled. On TV, James Seville looked every inch the guilty party. But what if this time, just this once, the obviously guilty guy was telling the truth?
Murder and the mob. Did he get an offer he couldn't refuse?
Would you tell Gotti, screw you, or Scarface or something like that? No.
You believed he was a mobster?
Yeah.
As the plot thickens.
When we come back, we're going to hear the other side of the story. We're going to hear from James Seville. Is he willing to confess what happened? Did he really join the mob? Those videotapes could help prove his case. Stay with us. We continue with the plot thickens. So far, you've heard portions of videotape that was shot by the police of James Seville building a bomb and planning to blow Sheriff Joe Arpaio. Now we're going to hear the other side of the story as Josh Mankiewicz goes to prison to interview James Seville.
This arrest of James Seville had been in the works for as long as a week.
The arrest led every evening newscast in Phoenix. James Seville had been caught on tape building a bomb to blow up Sheriff Joe Arpaio, one of the most popular elected officials in Arizona.
He'll kill whoever opens it. It's better than a hitman. The hitman can get caught.
If ever there was an open and shut case, this seemed to be it. Yet Seville claimed he was an innocent man and trapped by others, acting under a death threat. Could he possibly be telling the truth?
Spend life in prison or being killed, I'd rather spend life in prison.
James Seville admits he set himself up for trouble years ago. Even though he had a strong aptitude for science and mechanics, he had trouble completing high school. Afterward, he had no direction at all. His single mom, Rebecca, couldn't keep track of him.
I had to be at work or we wouldn't be able to pay the mortgage. I pretty much had to let him try on his own to straighten up.
That didn't work.
And it didn't work.
In 1997, Seville and a friend broke into their old school, Maryvale High, hoping to steal science equipment and sell it.
We didn't think that far ahead because you didn't have anybody to sell it to, but...
So this was disorganized crime?
Yeah.
It got worse. The two boys lit a Bunsen burner in one room, then, without lighting them, turned on all the burners in the room next door, turning the building into a potential bomb.
You know that turning gas on in one room and lighting a fire in the next room can produce a pretty sizable explosion.
We did it, but I wasn't thinking about actually the consequences of it, you know.
Investigators would later say the school was moments from exploding and taking a couple of police officers with it when firefighters turned off the gas. Seville claims he never wanted to hurt anyone. He was just going along with his buddy.
So, would I be correct in saying you're easily influenced?
Yeah, I guess.
Somebody urges you to do something even if it might not be the right thing. Maybe you go along even though you shouldn't.
Yeah.
James Seville was arrested and pleaded guilty to attempted arson. He received a 1.5-year sentence with most of the time in juvenile detention. But when Seville turned 18, the state of Arizona sent him to adult prison, where he met a man who would make his previous troubles seem like child's play. Thomas Morgan was 34. He'd spent a good portion of those years behind bars. In Seville's mind, Morgan was no common thug. His crimes were financial fraud, white-collar stuff. To an inmate like James Seville serving time for a stupid crime, that made Morgan someone special.
You looked up to him.
Well, you had to. I mean, when you're sitting next to him, and it's like the mouse next to a lion.
Seville says he was eager to impress Morgan, and one day he got the chance when he and the older man watched a TV show about bomb squads. Seville says Morgan asked him if he could diagram a bomb.
How do you know how to draw a bomb?
It's not hard. I know how to diagram. I used to do electronic circuits, you know, and I excel at science and math. I mean, you know, basic chemistry will teach you anything you want to know.
Seville says he and Morgan talked about other things too, like their criminal cases, the judges and prosecutors who put them away. They also discussed Sheriff Joe Arpaio.
He started talking about the sheriff and asked me what the best way to kill him was. And, you know, we're just joking.
Well, is that something people joke about in prison?
Yeah. Pretty much all the time.
But soon, Seville says, Morgan no longer seemed to be joking. Seville was getting out of prison in a week, and he says Morgan suggested he build a bomb and kill Arpaio.
Morgan told you that killing Sheriff Arpaio would make you a hero?
That's just one of the things he said.
Seville claims Morgan told him he could make a lot of money for killing Sheriff Joe. Seville says Morgan badgered him to call a man on the outside named Yancey. Seville says he was reluctant but finally gave in. And so from prison, he called a number Morgan gave him.
You say, I made the phone call, and he says what?
He says, you just joined the mob.
You just joined the mob?
Yes.
And what'd you think?
Oh.
Now Jimmy Seville's story veers from merely improbable to completely unbelievable. He claims Morgan now told him that he, Morgan, was a crime boss, and that Yancey was one of his button men.
That Yancey was Irish Mafia hitman, and Morgan was an Irish mobster that was Yancey's boss. I was supposed to meet Yancey and do what he told me to do.
Why couldn't you just say, the hell with you, I'm getting out of here in a little while, and I don't want to be involved in anything like this?
All right, would you tell Gotti, screw you, or Scarface or something like that? No.
You believed he was a mobster?
Yeah.
Seville was released from prison on July 8, 1999, and met Yancey the next day. He says he was convinced he had to, or else.
You gotta meet the sheriff. My whole family does. I hate that.
Was that all on act?
It was.
Seville claims that all the bravado you've heard on these tapes made the day of his arrest, all his talk of being an expert bomb maker and lone psycho, all of that was really a desperate attempt to impress Yancey and through him Morgan, two men Seville thought were mobsters, and in so doing, save his own skin.
You know, all apologies, but I think there's a case here that you were incredibly stupid.
Yeah, well, I mean, at the time, you know, you're thinking you're smart.
Yancey, he asked you flat out if you wanted to kill the sheriff, and you said yes. He said if you want to back out, now's the time, and you said you didn't want to.
See, there was other things there. I was told that there is no backing out.
Could Thomas Morgan possibly have had that kind of hold on Seville? And even if he did,
when you got out of prison, you're the guy that put the bomb components together, not him.
Yeah.
And you're the guy that got arrested for it.
Yeah.
And your defense is, it wasn't my idea? I was led to it by somebody else?
Yes.
But really, why should anyone believe Jimmy Seville? In order to do that, you have to believe that his cellmate, Thomas Morgan, cooked up a murder-for-hire plot. pressured Seville to go along, and even said he was a mobster to get Seville to comply. Under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and facing life in prison, Seville had every reason to concoct a story of entrapment. Even his own attorney was skeptical, except for one thing.
How many hours of conversations did the Sheriff's Department record between Thomas Morgan and Jimmy Seville?
Roughly 139 hours.
And as you'll see, those hours and hours of audio tape cast a whole new light on the story of James Seville.
Coming up next, could the target be the sheriff or somebody else? Josh Mankiewicz will let you hear all those audio tapes between Thomas Morgan and Jimmy Seville. Stay with us.
A jailhouse snitch and a startling twist.
A person has been coerced and threatened and entrapped into committing a crime.
As the plot thickens.
We've already seen the tapes that prove that James Seville was the one building the bomb. Let's look again through the eyes of the defense. He says those very same tapes say he's not guilty. Once again, here's Josh Mankiewicz.
Let's just say that for some reason he did talk to Joe and he blew him up to Joe. What kind of nigger would he think he is?
You're listening to Thomas Morgan talking to his cellmate James Seville. At the time, Seville had no idea that investigators had bugged the cell. But now he claims the tapes bear out his story that he was entrapped. That his sensational televised arrest for the attempted murder of a famous lawman was really a setup.
Morgan was smooth. He had always the right line. In a matchup against, 18-year-old Jimmy Seville, there was really no contest.
Seville's lawyer, Ulysses Farragut, says Thomas Morgan had informed on cellmates before in order to trade information for better treatment from his jailers. But in Seville's case, he claims, Morgan didn't just snitch. Farragut says Morgan actually made up the murder plot in order to finger Seville for it. He points to conversations like this one, in which Morgan seems to wake Seville out of a sound sleep to talk about murder. As the tape shows, Morgan brings up the sheriff. Morgan brings up a bomb. But Seville does mention sticking a pipe in his spokes, an apparent threat. Was Seville serious? Listen as the conversation continues. Does that sound like a bad joke? Remember, Seville says he was joking, but Morgan doesn't seem to get it. Just as Seville claimed, the tape shows Morgan also floated the idea of a murder for hire. Remember, Seville claims Morgan then told him of a guy who worked for Morgan on the outside, a man named Yancey, who would hire Seville for the murder. Seville says that Morgan told him Yancey was a hitman. What did Morgan really say? And if it seems, as Seville also claimed, that Morgan was the boss.
Let them help you because I got a thing in my organization for you, but you got to prove yourself.
Seville told us he was reluctant to call Yancey, but Morgan badgered him to do it. Once again, the tape seems to bear him out.
Just call me. I'm worried about you not calling. I told him you would call me, and then you'll know how real I am. Just call me.
One day before his release, Seville made the call, which was also tape recorded.
Yeah, is this Yancey? Yeah. Yeah, this is Seville calling from Payville. Hey, what's happening? Yeah, Tom told me to call you. He said, you might have a word for me when I get out. Yeah, I think we can help each other out. Yeah.
As you recall, Seville claims that when he went back to his cell, Morgan told him he had just joined the mob. And now Seville had to kill the sheriff because Morgan's underworld reputation was on the line.
I'll tell you right now, you're expecting me. I told you so much about you, and you got to be faithful to the word that I give.
And he said, don't double-cross me?
Don't double-cross me, you know what will happen.
Which means?
You know what will happen. That was pretty much left up to my imagination.
But soon, Seville says, Morgan left nothing to the imagination, explicitly threatening Seville and his family if Jimmy didn't kill the sheriff. That's a key part of Seville's story and basic to his claim of entrapment.
You got a bad investigation, and you're about to arrest a person that has been coerced and threatened and entrapped into committing a crime.
But now we come to a key glitch in Jimmy Seville's story. Those threats aren't on the tape. As it happens, the tape's made right after the phone call, right at the time Seville claims Morgan threatened him, are either blank or silent. How could that happen? Seville's attorney says he had the recordings analyzed by an expert. The finding, the tapes were rolling the whole time, but
the volume was turned down so that you could not hear the conversation on the tape.
At critical points.
Yes.
Accidental or deliberate?
You tell me.
A staggering implication. It's one thing to think that a cellmate with a wild imagination cooked up a plot and got Seville in trouble, but to imply that investigators turned down their own tape recorders is to accuse them of participating in Thomas Morgan's scheme.
Recording devices fail sometimes.
Jack McIntyre is the legal counsel to Sheriff Joe Arpaio, the alleged victim of Seville's alleged plot. So if someone sees a sinister purpose in this, the sheriff's office may have either not recorded certain conversations or blanked out certain conversations. That's just paranoia.
They're the same people that are monitoring Area 51 and waiting for the spaceship to take off every moment of every day.
He has a point. Of course, Seville's tales about Morgan sounded pretty bizarre too, until it turned out there were tape recordings to back them up. Now, what if there were also tape recordings showing that the entire time Thomas Morgan was cooking up his plot with Jimmy Seville, he was also working closely with detectives employed by the alleged victim, Sheriff Joe Arpaio? What if the Sheriff's Department's own tapes showed that detectives actually dictated to Morgan some of the stories that Seville says sucked him in? Impossible, right? Just wait and see.
Could the target of this murder scheme somehow be involved in it?
He's got a whole unit dedicated towards investigating threats. Sort of the ego of, I'm important and people are out to get me.
As the plot thickens.
There's more to the Sheriff Joe Arpaio story when we return. Now, there's more tapes to be heard from those investigators. Could they contain clues as to people who have threatened the sheriff? Josh Mankiewicz will dig deeper into those audio recordings. Stay with us. As you just seen, those audio tapes prove that James Seville was just joking about blowing up Joe Arpaio, making a car bomb. But we now know Yancey was also part of this. But could there be more clues as to who would threaten the sheriff? Josh Mankiewicz looks into the threatened sheriff.
James Seville was sitting in jail, charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder in a plot to blow up Arizona's most popular lawman, Sheriff Joe Arpaio. Seville and his lawyers made a remarkable claim that even though he'd been caught on tape building a bomb and bragging about wanting to kill the sheriff, Seville had really been set up by a cellmate named Thomas Morgan, who threatened his life if he didn't assassinate Arpaio.
He told you that you should.
He told me that I had to.
They found secret tape recordings made in prison by sheriff's investigators that seemed to support some of Seville's claims that Morgan was the driving force in the plot. But Seville's lawyer, Ulysses Farragut, makes another, even more serious claim, that the sheriff's office itself dictated much of what Morgan said on those tapes, in effect, helping to set up James Seville.
One of the fundamental requirements is that you not entrap the person by creating or suggesting the crime. And that's exactly what the sheriff's office did.
Was it possible the sheriff's department had helped railroad Jimmy Seville in a plot to assassinate the sheriff himself? It's the kind of thing no one would believe unless there was extremely convincing evidence, like, say, another trove of tape recordings, which is exactly what Seville's defense team obtained from the sheriff's department and shared with Dateline.
Prairieville Prison, we're going to talk to Thomas Morgan. Do you know what we're here about?
Pretty sure you know.
Okay.
June 30th, 1999, 9 days before Jimmy Seville would be released onto the streets of Phoenix, Maricopa County Sheriff's detectives were meeting for the first time with inmate Thomas Morgan, who said he had information that was, if you'll pardon the expression, explosive.
I'm in a cell with a nut, and he literally wants to kill his judge and his prosecutor. He just says he's going to send him a bomb, blow him up, and kill him.
What's his name?
David Seville.
Seville.
Right.
Farragut says Morgan had informed on cellmates before, trying to negotiate favorable treatment in return.
He had basically snitched on 2 other individuals in murder cases prior to Jimmy Seville.
Now Morgan was fingering Seville. Detectives had received this letter Morgan wrote to his minister 2 weeks before Seville was scheduled to be released. What I am about to tell you is very important and dangerous. I have recently learned of a plot to kill a Superior Court judge and a prosecutor. Morgan then goes on to name the intended victims. Names, you'll remember, Seville says Morgan wheedled out of him. The young man has given me explicit details on how he was going to do it. He is quite knowledgeable for his young age with explosives. I believe he knows what he is doing. Morgan says he has bomb diagrams, the ones Seville claims Morgan asked him to draw. Then, 3 paragraphs later, Morgan adds what seems like an afterthought. He talks about killing Sheriff Joe also.
It sounded like a very serious threat.
Jack McIntyre is chief counsel for the sheriff's office. He's talking to us because Sheriff Joe didn't want to.
Because the threat mentioned specific names, you sort of took it as being more credible than otherwise.
Oh, sure.
It probably didn't hurt that the sheriff himself was one of the names. He happened to be both the most famous lawman in Arizona and the boss of the 2 detectives sent to interview Thomas Morgan.
Is it any kind of conflict of interest, do you think, to have the sheriff's office investigating a threat against the sheriff?
I don't think there's any conflict there at all. That happens all the time. In every law enforcement agency.
That may be true, but it's also true that there may be no other law enforcement agency quite like the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Joe Arpaio is an elected official who's kept the highest profile he could create over the 12 years he's held office. His name is writ large on every facility he runs. His chain gang and Tent City Jail are known across the country. It's a rare week when Sheriff Joe is not quoted in the local news media, and a big part of his mystique is that Sheriff Joe fights crime despite constant threats on his life. The sheriff's office sent us a list of 10 people who've been convicted of threatening Sheriff Joe in just the last 5 years. Critics, like Ulysses Farragut, say that while some threats certainly are serious, the sheriff's department isn't above milking them for publicity.
Sort of the ego of, I'm important and people are out to get me. And his staff know this. In fact, he's got a whole unit dedicated towards threats, investigating threats.
Those 2 sheriff's investigators would have a pretty clear motive for focusing in on the plot to kill Sheriff Arpaio.
Oh, absolutely. Can you imagine? Hey, boss, look what we brought you. We come bearing gifts.
Farragut points to the fact that at the first meeting, Morgan did not even mention the sheriff until the detectives did.
Is that the only people he's threatened? Is the prosecutor?
Yeah, that's the only one that he's openly talked about.
How about the one in their letter you talked about? He made threats to Sheriff Joe Arpaio.
Oh, he said he'd be a hero if he blew up Sheriff Joe.
Cops will tell you that an experienced informant like Thomas Morgan reads the signals about what information is wanted and what he can trade for favors.
Doesn't the fact that the detectives bring up Sheriff Arpaio in that first meeting with Morgan, doesn't that send a signal to Thomas Morgan that this is what we're really interested in here?
I think you could probably read it that way, but I think in all fairness, he talked about all three.
But as detectives began listening to and recording Morgan's talks with James Seville, the investigation seemed to focus solely on the famous sheriff.
More than he wants to judge, he wants that prosecutor. He thrives on this prosecutor.
Not too many people know a prosecutor. He's not well known. Everybody knows Arpaio.
Listen to how detectives told Morgan to describe Yancey, the undercover detective they wanted Seville to call.
If we can get him hooked up with a guy that will say, call his name Yancey, he's got some money, and he might be able to make it worth your while to, maybe make something for him, to make a bomb, something like that, because he really wants Arpaio bad, because he doesn't like Arpaio at all.
I think he'd do it.
McIntyre says the detectives had to push hard and work quickly because Seville was about to be released from prison and they wanted to make sure they hooked him up with an undercover officer so they could keep track of him. But he also admits that when Seville was released from prison and did meet with Yancey, their bomb shopping spree was actually underwritten by the sheriff's office.
Mr. Seville does not even have a driver's license. Mr. Yancey's driving. Who's paying for the bomb parts?
Well, I think it's Yancey.
Whose vehicle is it?
It's Yancey's.
That's not you guys making this happen?
Oh, no, we could have very well been driving them to Circle K to get some Fritos, but Mr. Seville made the choices of what to get and where.
Good point. But what about the timing of the arrest? McIntyre admits Seville could have been arrested after he bought the first bomb part, or the last, or after he built the bomb, or after he took the money for doing that. Yet the undercover detective actually took Seville to a restaurant where the sheriff was having lunch, where the sheriff's car was parked, and where a local TV news crew had been tipped to show up with cameras rolling.
Whether or not the investigation was legitimate, it's pretty tough to argue that the arrest was not planned for cameras.
It was pretty convenient to have a television crew that was there and available.
The defense now had a theory of the case that a cunning informant and a publicity-hungry sheriff's office conspired to entrap James Seville. They had audio tapes that supported some of their claims, but were they willing to bet Seville's life that a jury would believe them?
The judge told Jimmy and his family very directly. He said, son, I've been doing this for, over 30 years, and I can tell you that no one wins an entrapment defense.
The prosecution offered a deal, plead guilty to attempted aggravated assault, and be sentenced to 10 to 15 years. With time served, Seville could get out in as little as 6. For Ulysses Farragut, it was time for a gut check.
When I'm looking at an 18-year-old kid who is facing life in prison, I have a responsibility to say to him, Jimmy, as much as I believe in you and your family believes in you, you need to be cautious here.
Seville's mom, Rebecca, had the same painful realization.
You were telling him, take the deal.
Yes, I was. I wanted him to have a life and not in prison.
By now, Jimmy Seville had been in jail for 4 years. A guilty plea meant at least 6 more. But in the end, he went for the deal.
And finally, I agreed to take it, because it was pretty stupid not to take it.
Seville pleaded guilty to the lesser charge, even though he and his family and his lawyers were all convinced he was not guilty. And then, as if this story weren't strange enough already,
we got to the office, and I get a phone call from the prosecutor. And he says, listen, there's a technical defect in the plea.
It was a tiny paperwork matter, a mistake in the reporting of Seville's criminal history, but the plea itself could not be finalized without correcting it. Farragut told the prosecutor he'd get back to him on making the change, but then the phone rang again. This time it was the sheriff's sergeant who had been in charge of surveillance on the day of Jimmy Seville's arrest, and who was no fan of Sheriff Joe Arpaio's regime.
And he starts telling me, he says, look, I don't feel good about the investigation, and I don't feel good about your client taking a plea. And as he starts telling me this, I start scrambling for a tape recorder.
In a case full of key moments caught on tape, here's the capper.
I mean, if I've ever seen anybody coerced or set up, it was him.
And you think it was all for sort of the publicity angle for the sheriff?
Well, look at the news cameras that were there at the time of the arrest.
Farragut rushed to the jail and told Seville.
And I said, listen, here's the scenario. You've got a bad plea, and we've got an undercover officer that says it's a bad case. What do you want to do? And Jimmy said, I want out of my plea.
What did the prosecutor say when you said, I want to avoid the plea agreement?
Basically, are you crazy? We've got him on tape making a bomb. Are you crazy?
And you said?
We might be.
They may be crazy. Coming up next, the conclusion to the story. Will Jimmy Seville get life in prison, or will he walk free? Those audio tapes could help, and the lawyers could help shine the light on this case. Stay with us. Well, we have now run out of time, but we're going to continue this on Wednesday. Will Jimmy Seville plead guilty on charges of building a bomb and conspiring to blow up Sheriff Joe Arpaio, or will he plead not guilty and go free? Those audio tapes and the defense and the jurors are about to get a real taste on what's happening. That's on Wednesday. That's Gimme a Break for this Monday. We'll see you again for Gimme a Break Wednesday as the plot thickens. Follow us here at YouTube and Gimme a Break. I hope you've had a great day. Good night, everyone.